den rechten.
Bir müşteri olan
Den rechten Teil an der Nordseite.
Moving forward.
And now, the moment we've been waiting for, the final and last session that will bring to a resounding end the session of the last 2 days. In the audience, you have 3 people who have taken notes. One of the 3 you know, Jean-Marc Offner, has already revealed his identity. We got the impression that there was a private dialogue, almost a very intimate dialogue with Francis Bossier. You also have Marie-Flore Mattei working from PUCA. PUCA now has a face on it. And then you have Laurent Thévoz, who spoke briefly this morning. So all 3 of you have a significant task. It is for you to tell us what should be remembered of these 2 very intense days of discussion. What you take home? Is there something that you found surprising? Have you already heard everything? Have things irked you? Were you pleasantly surprised by other things? Have you gotten new glasses? Because that's a question only for Laurent Thévoz. He's the only one wearing spectacles. We were told we should look at things through different views. Well, ladies first.
Merci beaucoup de m'avoir demandé d'être le grand témoin. Tâche très...
Thank you. There was lots of talk about over the past 2 days, all sorts of exchanges, and I was wondering, just Sylvain Kahn was saying, I work for PUCA, and you could well, I mean, we could very well, this is a planning agency that could plan things for the next 50 years, but there are many questions that remain unanswered. Let me just tell you my impression. I mean, this is a sort of a patchwork. I cannot really give you a well-structured presentation because the views themselves and the positions themselves or the points themselves are somewhat disseminated. So, first of all, by way of an introduction, Vincent Kaufmann said that one should not give the floor, one should take the floor. And taking the floor means taking the initiative. And it's true that a number of scientists, but scholars, Jean-Michel Roux, Martine Berger, Francis Bossier, and others, took the initiatives. And it is true that some time ago that issue was already being studied before they were asked to study the matter. But back in the days, there was rather little work being done about this. But now we can see by the large number of people following this that this has become much more than an obscure subject of research. So this has taken on. Another point, whether you want to defend it or well, the same arguments are used against against Peri-urban as were used to criticize the central city. In other words, the same defects were found, are being found now in Peri-urban as were found back then in the central city. Now, one thing is for sure, Peri-urban, if we can call it that, is here to stay. That is something we have seen. This is a structure that has taken root and will be here for some time. And not only it is a place where people live, it is also a place of potential economic output. There is, and that opportunity, that potential should be seized upon. Now, now, we've been discussing this over the past 2 days, and you can well see that the issue was addressed in different ways, but it's one thing to paint Peri-urban with a black tar, but you shouldn't at the same time say that it is a perfect place either. I mean, the Peri-urban has its qualities and its defects, its advantages and its drawbacks. It's not all black or white. And then the third point is Peri-urban was seen to be completely dependent on the nearby urban center, or possibly something that was a continuation of the denser urban fabric. And so it was believed in one respect to be completely subordinate to the city. And then other surveys, other studies now have taken the opposite view, saying that the peri-urban areas are much more self-sustaining, self-dependent. But then the issue becomes so exciting that people are concerned about the place for itself. They're not concerned about its actual properties, its features, its functions. And so the temptation is there not to look at the subject, but at the object. Now, that takes me to my points. The first thing is to take a step back. Taking a step back, I found the idea of match the views of scholars with the views of artists and workers, people who, I mean, the sort of artistic approach and the academic approach, if you bring them together, can help us take a new or a fresh look at the subject. And so if you are an academic or even somebody involved in urban planning, this artistic view, the message from the arts, can provide a new perspective. Now, in this catalog, I mean, lots of issues have been addressed, but I'm not going to read through the whole list of the issues that were broached. I can only list a few. Now, one thing is for sure, there's no such thing as one peri-urbanite. You have many profiles, many situations, both in terms of where people live and who they are, where they stand in social terms. It may be pretty self-evident. It may sound pretty self-evident, but this was clearly shown in the papers, in the presentations. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to prove it, it's another thing, again, to take it on board, to really take this on board. And this morning, all participants agreed on the fact that on the diversity of the peri-urbanites, the peri-urban dwellers, but in the exchanges, in the views, very often the peri-urban dweller was reduced to a single. And then peri-urban deregulation, or at least deregulation in the peri-urban space. It's true that if you look at peri-urban areas, they are somewhat disorganized compared to the city. There is or self-organization, at least that seems to be the case. And to some extent, self-organization may be a good thing. The main thing is that you'd like there to be some form of organization. But is it not the case that deregulation that used to be the case, is it not precisely deregulation that makes the peri-urban sphere interesting, that gives it its very characteristic? Now, another point is that these are times of environmental as well as the economic crisis. And so if you look at economic output in the city, but very often you have in the peri-urban areas, the options for economic output are seen on a case-by-case basis. It's not seen as one big area that needs to be organized. it is individual decisions to have zones of production, etc. Now, you have to remember that back in the 60s or 70s, there was some informal housing, unregulated, uncontrolled housing. But just because things were unregulated or sort of informal, well, just because something was informal didn't mean it was illegal. And especially in these areas, things were done in a sort of spontaneous, self-generating way. But it wasn't necessarily illegal. And in this respect, Annie Fourcault's presentation that compared what happened right after, or presented what happened after World War II, the situation with people who had to make do with very inadequate accommodations. That situation has its own echo today, and the question is, and Marc Dumont said this, what can local authorities do about shortcomings? Now, Marc Thibault talked about these, what we call the petty buses, the walking buses, as it were. These sort of informal buses have not become institutional, but the reason they do not become formal or institutional is that then they lose their interest, and people wouldn't use them anymore, and it might not work as well. So there's this informality that can be very necessary. And then, likewise, we talked about the economic potential of peri-urban areas is to do also with their adaptability. And very often these peri-urban areas are seen to be buffer zones between the city and the rest of the world. Now, in terms of adaptability, there were all sorts of things that were said. Peri-urban housing can be very flexible. You can have your own garden, you can grow your own vegetable, etc. Then there was an interesting thing said about the Italian situation. Originally, the family house was usually made to accommodate just one family, but because of the economic crisis, you can have as many as 2 or 3 families living under the same roof, and so that's the way detached houses have become semi-detached houses, where they've been divided up, and that is true for individual houses, and the sort of thing is happening also now to apartment buildings that are in a way adapted to suit the new situation. Now, one thing is for sure, and we've all said that, peri-urban areas are not all of the same shade. There are all sorts of colors there. There are different situations. And also, it should be seen that the demographics are somewhat specific in peri-urban areas. You say that you have for every 3 youngsters under 20, you have 2 senior citizens 60 years or over. Now, maybe old people can live in the suburbs, but the younger generation gets bored. Now, it may be true, but in the cities and in most suburbs, teenagers can move whichever way they like. They can find their friends, they can walk there, they can find public transportation, so it is not an issue. In most peri-urban areas, you haven't got the situation. Now, it is the case for older people who might have trouble mobility issues, but youngsters haven't got this problem, so they can cycle to move about, or they can take motorcycles or something. But it's true that bicycles are not always safe because of the prevalence of cars. But there still is the possibility for the younger generation, the accessibility issue, and so the fact that the younger generation gets bored living out there is not really relevant in as much as accessibility is there to relieve the tedium and the boredom. Now, the other issue that was raised is to what extent do people take ownerships of these territories? To what extent do people feel at home? They like their neighborhoods, and we find that people tend to live in the same areas and organize their lives in a rather small radius around their homes. Now, this may well be true. There's some degree of route taking attachment to your neighborhood. And I would like to conclude with a quote by Jean-Marc Offner about a government report on peri-urban areas. It said that 40 years ago, the same questions were asked, the same observations were made as today. What was the case 40 years ago remains the case today, and sometimes research tends to be to forget things. History repeats itself, and some questions are asked again and again, even though they were already addressed many years before. But it's sometimes true that policies are schizophrenic. On the one hand, you want to prevent urban sprawling, and at the same time, you have zero interest rate mortgage loans, house loans. But I doubt that 30 or 50 years from now we'll be in the same situation. It's true that 30 years from now you can expect things to change. But on the one hand, you want to refrain, to control urban sprawling, and yet you encourage it by offering these low interest home loans. Now, if you want to describe the reality, we find that the way the peri-urban areas is being defined has lost some of its meaning, because the way you look at the world, or the way you define it, the way you model it, makes it different from reality. Now, of course, there are things going on. You have new equipment. When you talk about proximity, it's not the same today as it was 25 years ago. You have new technologies. You have more efficient cars. You have more public transportation. And distances do not mean the same thing. Distances can be overcome. Within the same family, people may not cover the same territory because of all sorts of circumstances. And when you look at towns in the peri-urban area, it used to be a limited area that people could take on board. But now the limits are fuzzy. It's not as though you can stick this urban area to one specific area. You can only capture fragments of it. And lifestyles also cannot be captured down to one style. You can find certain lifestyles in various neighborhoods, but you have center everywhere, you have periphery everywhere. I mean, this sounds like something of a caricature, but it's true. You have different things in different places, and also different things in the same places. And yet, the only reference we have is comparing this sort of mixed picture with the historical representation of the city. And so, because of this sort of comparison that does not work, it is difficult to even understand the way the urban city works. You said 10 minutes would be, you had too much time, and now you have actually gone past the limit. Well, thank you so much. I've been rambling on, and this is not just a sort of a gratuitous intellectual exercise. But if you want to think in sustainable terms, you shouldn't sort of oppose the two models, the city center versus the peri-urban areas, even though there are some nuances. But you have to look at the urban world at large, even though there may be differences. You have to take everything on board. You should not oppose the two. You have to see the way one is a continuation or a reflection of the other. And I think maybe a new concept should be defined. There could be some heuristic value in describing the peri-urban sphere. And that's where laboratories or observatories could be made, because this is where things are are happening. And at PUCA, we are thinking of having just such observatories in these peri-urban spaces. And you have, if you have sort of iconic sites you want to show us, we might want to look at them. Well, thank you so much, Marie-Flore Mattei, for having presented your views.
Laurent Thévoz. Alors, le point de vue du grand témoin de l'EPFL, l'École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne.
I was thinking what I would tell my friends back home, coming back from this symposium. Not being French myself, what I found rather interesting was the fact that you often refer to the French paradox, to French specificity, especially as regards bicycles. You refer to the situation of bicycles in France, the way in which bicycles are underrepresented, underused. And until now, I thought France was the country of the Tour de France. But the Tour de France is for the real cyclists with muscles on their legs. Yeah, well, there's lots of talking and less doing happening in France, and that's something I'll remember. France is a country where people talk about things, but they don't do much. Now, of course, my viewpoint is subjective, but I will say one thing: we have. There's a saying that a proverb that says you cannot hear a forest growing, and I think that urbanization is a process that you cannot watch, that happens unnoticed, as it were, and this is why territorial lines shift all the time without you noticing it. And likewise, the growth of the peri-urban area is something that is difficult to monitor. It's difficult to see how growth in general can be managed through urbanization. And then a Bolivian historian called Zavaleta believes that the three forms of time happen simultaneously or begin simultaneously. So I can wear a hat as a scholar looking at the medium term and the long term, but as a consultant, I work on the short term, as a consultant or indeed as an elected official of the regional parliament. So short, medium, and long term can and should be seen at the same time. So I'm more comfortable with systemic approaches rather than simplistic black and white approaches or mutual exclusions. I like opposites that complete one another, and this is what I would like to present. I had prepared a couple of slides, but they also disappeared in the wreck in the Bermuda Triangle of the control room. No. There you have it. There you have it. Well, that's very good. So we were told about. Well, I thought we might hear the story or the history of peri-urbanization. And of course, everybody said it was difficult to define, and yet people talked a lot about it. And so we tried to see whether peri-urbanization was a good thing or a bad thing, whether it was sustainable or not, whether there were some good guys, some bad guys, etc. At the end of the day, there were all sorts of discussions, even though we didn't quite know what we were talking about. But there were parts of the discussion where we tried to. And I think everybody has agreed now. We spent time recognizing the fact that there's several forms of peri-urbanization, but they can cover, well, say the same outline can cover all forms of peri-urban situations. And in order to, and that means one has to understand the logic of the players over and beyond their individual specificities. In Switzerland, we also have our bad mayors. I mean, you don't like the mayor, you get a new one, same story. Or you look at the mayor in the next village, same story. So maybe it's the situation that obliges these mayors to adopt a certain behavior, because there is only so much they can do. And maybe one should try and understand what that common trend is, rather than trying to look at individual differences. Now, there was not enough said about relationship between the compact city and peri-urbanization. And I think it is essential, because that really is the main difference, isn't it? It's a matter of density. I don't know many compact cities that haven't got a peri-urban area around it. I mean, there may be counterexamples, Los Angeles maybe, but what sort of, imagine a very compact city with nothing around it. Somehow it would have to take on board all sorts of functions that it needs. For instance, if you haven't got green areas or leisure areas or low rent areas or low rent buildings or garbage heaps, or rather, I mean, if you want to take all this back into the walls of the compact city, it won't work. So inevitably, you need to reach out to the outside world, and so if growth is to be sort of managed, it has to happen across the territory, irrespective of your preferences. It has to find its way from the compact city to the periphery. I mean, of course, the city helps promote or develop the peri-urban, but conversely as well, and it works both ways. And it's not an either-or thing. It's and so you shouldn't consider the peri-urban as an abnormality. I could have shown you the 15 pictures of places where I live, where I have lived. I don't mean to say that I was responsible for the developments of these peri-urban areas, but I think we have to agree to the fact that the city, the compact city, and the peri-urban areas are partners, and they will remain partners for the next 40 years. But you have to look back 40 years to see how that relationship has emerged, how it has grown, how it has evolved. And on this slide, I want to mention some of the concepts that were discussed, and to sort of represent them for the next few years. There will be more peri-urbanization, and this is bound to happen. You cannot turn this around overnight, but it means that you have existing stock built stock that is there, that you can not really avoid, but maybe you can draw the lessons of what was done over the past 40 years, maybe to get some feedback about what happens today, to try and understand the connection between yesterday and today, what lessons from the past, what mistakes not to repeat. I mean, I don't know if it's been done. I don't know if it's a sort of thing that is available in, I mean, if that knowledge is available to promoters, mayors, investors, households trying to buy a home, knowing where not to go, what not to do, what mistakes not to make in peri-urban terms.
And then in peri-urbanization, I really liked the presentations by Mr. Sievert yesterday and this morning about the changes in the future. I can see the dangers of more independent peri-urbanization, but it's evolving. It's already started, and there are a number of avenues that have been discussed. Apart from the fact that it ought to be decentralized in order to be sustainable, I think that it is probably a big challenge in France, given the institutional structure and the breakdown of competencies. But there are some avenues that have been discussed, for instance, energy transition, densification, mixed housing, jobs, the peri-urban structure. There are a number of things that can grow to change the face of peri-urbanization. All that can go right. But although you change your glasses, it's also important to change your eyes, or what's even behind your eyes. There's a big problem of governance, and here I need to look at my list. You have 7 minutes left. Well, that's more than comfortable. In fact, I understood that the first thing that I grasped is the need for everyone to let go collectively. Not try and control everything, impose things, force people, have a certain type of directed urban planning. I think that in a way, there's no single institutional system that can claim it can control the whole of urbanization. You can steer it, you can frame it, you can avoid excesses, but trying to control it entirely is a losing battle. And I think that we all really need to let go of things. We are still tempted to try and control things entirely. Another question, what about aspirations? Are there good aspirations with a certain political color or bad aspirations of a certain political current? And what about those aspirations? Do we deny them? Do we integrate them? Do we separate them? But we need to respond to these aspirations, whatever they are. And I understand that regarding governance, it's important to change the rules between players, because different players that follow the same rules will produce the same things. And in that sense, if I got your point right, the first thing that seems important is to have a governance scheme that makes local experiments easier. They ought to be decentralized and sustainable in order to contribute to the peri-urban transition. That includes a lot of players. This morning we've discussed a few SNCF. Yesterday people were talking about Caisse des Dépôts, the French public bank. Of course, public policy by the central government. I don't know what the possibility is to have regional governments involved or groupings of towns, public and mostly private players and investors. Here you need better governance in order to produce new territories. In this respect, a couple of things seem important. First of all, reforming local authorities. Since I'm Swiss, it's particularly striking to be made aware of local dynamics, or rather the lack of local political dynamics that are shared and fully decentralized. It's really striking and even shocking at times. I understood that there were problems of conflicts between national policy. Be reassured, it's inevitable. Maybe you need to measure the intensity of these conflicts. Maybe it's an illusion to try and avoid them, but you need to make these policies as compatible with one another as possible. And then I understood that someone ought to pay for these operations. First the experiments, then that could be replicated elsewhere later on. And the financial framework that I don't exactly understand. I don't know how the revenues are shared between the various levels of government, but a solution must be found so that there is a chance that the peri-urban areas can be involved in a rebalancing of development that's needed. Those are the main things I wanted to discuss. If I've got one more minute, I can't resist the temptation to show you two things I wrote about the relationship between density and mobility. It's a chicken and egg problem. Wherever you start, what matters really is the interdependency between these two items. The more density you have, the less mobility you have, and the less mobility you have, the more mobility you have, the less density you have. Then Vincent Kaufmann talked about motility that has an impact on mobility. In order to produce density, these things are not really clear to me. I don't really clearly see how motility leads to different mobility and what would be the consequences on density. And that's why I produced that last slide that suggests that we should explore the relationships between multi-residentiality and motility. Now there are households who have several places of residence where they live on a permanent basis or occasionally, and not talking about second holiday homes, which are very important, which are part of multi-residentiality. But how do these multi-residents contribute to density? Is that increasing it? Is that decreasing it? And I'm really puzzled about all the implications. Thank you very much, Laurent Thévoz.
Merci beaucoup, Laurent Thévoz.
Okay, now third witness, Jean-Marc Offner.
De nos grands témoins, Jean-Marc Offner.
Thank you. Well, I'm not as formally professional as EPFL, but I tried to make an effort about the title of my talk. I'm going to talk about the tree, the mayor, and the hedgehog. It's a sort of fable, Jean de La Fontaine style. Well, I was rather referring to Éric Rohmer. Well, why the tree? We saw very nice pictures this last morning, and I saw that when there were no trees, it was really ugly. It was really the cover of Télérama, and when you had trees, it was really nice. So at the end of the day, in order to go from residential hell in Les Chalandonnettes in the 1970s, under the name of Chalandon, a housing minister under President Giscard. So in order to go from this Chalandonnette hell to rural heavens of garden cities imagined by pioneers of urban planning, residential posh districts, well, maybe all you need is a few trees. As you know, in New York, there's a program 1 million trees. So maybe we could have a big peri-urban program with 65 million trees. They can be apple trees, but not only. And on the one hand, our minister can hear the rustling leaves of development, and that would also shed a violent light on this issue, because in peri-urban areas you can never have a large-scale project, but that's mostly a large-scale national project that's articulated through 65 million small projects. So if Cécile Duflot and her colleagues want to discuss it, well, they can take the idea. It's not as stupid as it sounds, actually. Now the mayor. In fact, there are several mayors. I would like to recognize three friends, mayor friends who are slightly different. First of all, the tens of thousands of mayors who lead tens of thousands of small French communes of less than 2,000 inhabitants. These mayors regulate or not everything that we've talked about these last 2 days. Of course, they don't have time to come to this Mobile Lives Forum. They don't even know about its existence. They don't have time either to think a lot about what they're doing because they've got so many things to do. And yet they effectively are the people who micromanage these peri-urban spaces with all the decisions that they make. Vincent Renard has already talked about it. He's our land expert in France, and he's often said that out of 100 houses built every year, 2/3 are individual homes, and out of these 2/3, there's 2/3 of diffuse or scattered housing. And this is really the problem that evades all regulation. Now, a forward-looking thought now, maybe peri-urban mayors will become national political leaders. Maybe they will tackle this issue in the future. This morning, Jean-Pierre said that we are ruled by gerontocrats. But at least our leaders are mayors or former mayors of big urban cores or presidents of departmental councils. And given the average age, most of their career happened before people left the countryside than after that. And most departments in France now have seen drastic changes, and there's no single forum to talk about the peri-urban. Most people want to fight big cities and regenerate the countryside. It's a real issue. It has to do with election modes, with how political elites are chosen, as they say, but it seems that in Houdan there's someone interesting, but we're looking for elected officials who may really address these issues full on. And then a third type, here, the last thing that I'm going to report on when I go back to Bordeaux, because I've got to give legitimacy to my absence, I report to the Urban Planning Agency, and we have a lot of bosses here. We report to a lot of people, but I have two bosses who are more important than the others. First, the president of the urban community of Bordeaux, the president of the Urban Planning Agency, Vincent Feltes. That's the man you had in mind as the future president coming from the Peri-urban. He's a borderline case. He was mayor of Blanquefort, a small town, which has peri-urban practices, but which is inside the urban community. So I'll tell him what I did here, and I'll also tell Alain Juppé what I did here. He is the only mayor of Bordeaux that you know of, but he's only mayor of Bordeaux now. He's the gerontocrat you were talking about? No, I would never allow myself, says the speaker. And he's much younger than most departmental council presidents. So what am I going to tell him? Well, I'm going to say what Marie-Flore said and all others said. You were deceived, good people. The government deceived you. Urban planners deceived you. The peri-urban phenomenon is not a shameful disease that needs to be eradicated. That's number one. Secondly, there's not one single type of peri-urbanite, but several types. I won't come back to that. Forget about holistic interpretations, and you also need to qualify the critiques leveled at peri-urban areas based on environmental reasons. That's going to be a shocker for them, because you can't change paradigms easily. It's the theory of a scientific revolution. The pendulum swings, but it does take time. I'm slightly less pessimistic than Jean-Pierre. I think that we're lagging behind by 10 years or 20 years, but we can still win the war. And for an organization like ours, we ought to think about how we can raise awareness much more quickly amongst local or national elected officials about these issues. Stopping urban sprawl is no longer an issue, but the really an important issue is how to organize peri-urban sprawl. What are they going to tell me? Well, they will say, yes, that does sound interesting what you're saying. Maybe one of them will be surprised that a bill being prepared spends most of its time explaining why we need to fight peri-urban sprawl, but he'll need to explain that to his political friends. And I think that both these gentlemen are going to say, okay, it's all good, it's very good to organize the peri-urban, but that's not my problem. My problem is rather to create a million people metropolis. I want more density. I need to act to build density, a more compact city, for lots of reasons, in order to be on the map, the European map of a million of cities with 1 million inhabitants, because people tell me that you need more people to reach critical mass. It's also true that in Bordeaux streets, well, they're rather empty at nights, and the urban gradient of a city like Bordeaux is not big. And most of all, when you've invested billions in collective equipment, it would be a good thing it was actually used. And since we're investing 1 billion euros to extend tramway lines, it would be a good thing if people actually rode the tram, which is far from granted. And as Laurent started saying already, the variable that was lacking in the equation previously is the issue of population growth. What happens? What's the distribution? Here we're not a supreme Soviet, but what about the distribution of population growth, rather in the urban core or in the peri-urban areas? But if you want to organize the peri-urban areas, it's easier if you've got population growth. If you have more people to be directed here and there. So in Toulouse, in the west, in the south, we are lucky enough to have such population growth. So it may be a bit far-fetched, but we can believe in it. We can believe in having more density, but also having more growth in peri-urban spaces so that they can really change for the better. But I think that the other half of France, other than the west and the south, the schruppenden Städten, said German cities that are shrinking, telling their inhabitants to consume more water, otherwise the water stagnates in the pipes, and that's very bad. And I think that this issue of population growth is very important. It really must be part of the debate again. And I'll need to answer to these gentlemen. If they tell me that's your problem and we don't care, well, I need to convince them that this is their problem too. If they want to build a metropolis, out of the definitions of a metropolis, of metropolization, there's the issue that interdependencies between territories are growing, are becoming more intense. And I'll try and explain to them, well, it's already been said during the forum and even right now, the notion of solidarity between the urban core and the peri-urban is a central issue. So they have to tackle that. Solidarity, interdependency, political solidarity, financial solidarity. This is where the cookie crumbles, especially since now there's no real forum for debate and negotiation about these issues. Hence, the avenues for thinking that I may propose about who carries the projects, intellectually, technically, politically, institutionally, economically. Because now the best definition of the peri-urban is to think that this is a territory where there are no major players. You said that differently, with a lot of self-regulation and weak links. Now, we've talked about players a little to try and give rise to systems of players. Urban players all dream about intercommunal leaders who will emerge because the map of intercommunality will be redrawn and at last we'll have figureheads in these territories. It seems paradoxical to wish for figureheads, but we want to have legitimate players with whom we can talk. So intercommunal leaders. At the département level, let's not be desperate. Maybe there will be a revolution in departments and maybe they'll think that what we call peri-urban is peri-rural, that it's a different way of organizing rural spaces. That would be interesting, but then departments should do away with this idea of canton egalitarianism, because it completely skips the fact that there are territorial specificities. Another thing that's interesting is hybrid players, landscape planners. In my agency, I stopped recruiting urban planners and architects. I recruit landscape planners because they're interested in large-scale territories. They look at intermediate spaces. They are interested in trees. So I think that we need to invent a new skill for the peri-urban, which will mostly be found with landscape planners than with major architects. Another example, the post office. I'm not talking about the SNCF, so I had to find another example. The post office is a great local operator, very energetic, very surprising, with a lot of postmen, not just carrying mail, but also a lot of other things, bringing a lot of other things in their satchels. And we were talking about new proximity, trying to have better coverage, different coverage of the territory. Amongst new players, there are the new entrepreneurs who sell applications, people like Ludovic Bou, who have 10,000 ideas a minute, and sometimes one works out, but it will turn him into the new head of Google in a few years. Also, shopping mall managers, it's like elected officials. A few are smart, and they are smart by definition because they adjust very quickly. One type of player that may be surprising, regional healthcare agencies. Healthcare is a major issue, and it will become even more of a problem for young people, old people. Access to healthcare can no longer be organized the way it is today. And so ARS, as it's called, the regional healthcare agencies, can become a major player in the peri-urban space. So no peri-urbanization without happy metropolization, that would be my catchphrase. And I agree with what my colleague said here, the fact that the peri-urban space is probably a preferred experimental ground for renewed public action with renewed players, with more soft measures than hard measures, more partnerships rather than isolated institutional action, a lot of small projects rather than huge red ribbon, large-scale projects for which you can have front-page photos of grand openings, a lot of hands-on experimentation rather than technical doctrine. It may be wishful thinking, but it anticipates on the fact that these modes of action that are very suited to the peri-urban space can also be rolled out to other spheres of public action. And what about the hedgehog, you may say? Well, the hedgehog is a slow animal. Well, the hedgehog is not the sacrificial victim of a peri-urban motorist who runs over hedgehogs with pleasure when going to work in the morning. It's Schopenhauer's expression, like hedgehogs being cold in the winter and getting closer together. And if they go too close to each other, they sting each other, so they have to move further apart again. And I like this idea of the right distance. My idea is that if architects are in charge of places, urban planners are in charge of spacing, distance, regulation, the near and the close, the near and the far. And that harks back to a lot of things that were said, how to reinvent new forms of proximity, how to reconcile the various scales that geographers care so much about. Some sociologists say that the peri-urban works well because it offers the right distance to inhabitants who are interested in this sort of metric. So to conclude, I think that in order to grasp these right distances, that are also fair distances but are suited to the various lifestyles, this is in line with the ambition of this forum to design the right mobile lives. And since I'm the last to speak before our moderator, I would like to warm-heartedly thank the Mobile Lives Forum, because I think that they found the best way of working. Really, it was an interesting forum which got us thinking a lot over the last 2 days. Thank you a lot, very much, Jean-Marc Offner.
Den Rechten.